Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm really glad to introduce you all to this book launch. It's the book launch for Singular Cells, An Introduction to Single Studies, edited by MCH's Dr. Ketiki Chakhani and Dr. Craig Gwynn. So Dr. Ketiki Chakhani, as all of you know, is an assistant professor at Manipal Center for Humanities, where she teaches India's first ever course on single studies. She is the co-editor of Singular Cells and the author of The Limits of Sexuality Education, Love, Sex, and Adolescent Masculinities in Urban India, both published by Routledge in 2024. Her other writings on gender, sexuality, and singlehood have appeared in the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics, the Journal of Porn Studies, the New York Times, Square Peg, and The Hindu, as well as in edited volumes published by Routledge, Cambridge University Press, and the Temple University Press. Ketiki is an avid birder, dabbles in music composition and painting, and is training for the national level masters swim meet. Joining us today is also Dr. Paramita Chakravarti, who's going to engage with us in a discussion on the book and discuss the discipline of single studies. So, Dr. Paramita Chakravarti is a professor at the Department of English and has been the director of the School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University, Calcutta. She has completed her doctoral studies at the University of Oxford. She teaches Renaissance drama, women's writing, sexuality, and film studies. She started one of the first queer studies postgraduate courses in India in the Department of English at Jadavpur University. Her work in the School of Women's Studies has focused on education and sexuality. She has led national and international projects on gender representation in school textbooks, sexuality education, women's higher education, homeless women, women in the Panchayati Raj, and in self-help groups, as well as HIV-positive women and children, and sex workers. She has worked with the state and central government, the Women's Commission, state and national, the government ministries of education, the Panchayat, rural development, and HIV control and prevention boards, as well as with international universities on policy related to women's education, empowerment, and health. Dr. Chakravarti is also the founder member of the NGO Ibong Alap, which works on critical pedagogies and serves as the board member of Anjali, an NGO which works on issues of mental health, and is an advisor of Darbar, a sex workers collective. She is also part of the advisory board of Nirantar, a NGO working on gender and education. She has been working for the last 4 years on a project on mobilizing single women in Darjeeling with Sappho, a queer collective. She has redesigned and co-taught Kriya's feminist leadership course in South Asia and East Africa for the last 5 years. She has conceptualized and scripted a short film on the history of sex work in colonial Kolkata called Sex Work in the City, which has won 2 Ladli Awards. She has also acted as advisor in 7 films under the series Borderlines, on conversations with South Asian feminists produced by Third Eye, a portal on gender and education. Her book, Women Contesting Culture, co-edited with Kavita Punjabi, was published by Stree in 2012. Her book on Shakespeare and Indian cinemas was published by Routledge in 2018, and Asian Interventions in Global Shakespeare was also published in 2020 by Routledge. Her book, Bengal and Italy, Transcultural Encounters from Mid-19th to Early 21st Centuries, has come out in 2023. Her book on Cultures of Aging and Ageism in India, published by Routledge, is forthcoming. I would like to invite Dr. Emma to present Dr. Paramita Chakravarti with a memento from MCH. And I would like to invite both Dr. Ketiki Chakhani and Dr. Paramita Chakravarti to the stage. Congratulations again, Dr. Ketiki. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Professor Paramita Chakravarti, for being here for the launch of the book. I'm going to start by reading from the introduction, just a small portion, and then we will be in conversation about the book. So this introduction was written by me and my co-editor, Craig Gwynn. So let me start. Singlehood has gotten a bad rap, from microaggressions like, "You're still single," and "When are you getting married or settling down?" to portrayals in the media like the lonely spinster or the wild playboy who won't settle down. Singlehood is seen as a problem, a temporary state, something to be fixed. The term singlism was coined by American social psychologist Bella De Paulo in 2005 defined as the stereotyping and stigmatizing of people who are single, as well as the discrimination against them. In a 2006 book, Bella De Paulo called singlism the 21st century problem that has no name. She coined the term in the spirit of consciousness raising, as equivalent to terms such as sexism, racism, and casteism. In 2020, the term singlism was added to the Cambridge English Dictionary. Singlism can be of two kinds. One, institutionalized singlism, and two, socio-cultural singlism. For instance, in the United States, a person upon death can leave social security benefits to a spouse or child, but not a sibling, friend, or even a domestic partner. There are many other such examples in the extensive work of Bella De Paulo in the context of the United States, which ranges from housing discrimination, workplace discrimination, higher taxation, discrimination within the healthcare system. Sociocultural singlism ranges from microaggressions, such as why are you not married yet, how come you're single, etc., to a lack of or stereotypical representations of uncoupled people in cinema, television, and literature, casting them as lonely, depraved, frustrated, evil, or just plain sad. So think of Cruella in 101 Dalmatians or Bridget Jones in Bridget Jones' Diary. Bella De Paulo also coined the term matrimania, which she described as the glorification of marriage and coupling, especially the "you are my everything" variety. Matrimania is most pronounced in media, with the over-the-top glorification of celebrity weddings. So think of Priyanka Chopra and Nick Jonas's highly publicized weddings, or of all the highly publicized weddings of actors and actresses and influencers that we see today. The trending social media hashtag couple goals, and one of the reasons why I started the hashtag singlehood goals, and the couple reels and videos on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Craig Wynne builds on this to coin a term called procreamania, which he refers to as a societal obsession with having children. Now, there are other key concepts on single studies, but I'm not going to read that out because I want you to buy the book, and it's outside. Sorry. Okay, you can buy it outside later after the launch. So, but how do we envisage single studies? And that's going to be the last section I'm going to read before I hand over the mic to Professor Chakravarty. In 2007, Bella De Paulo, along with Rachel Moran and Kate Schimberger, made a call to include the perspective of single people in teaching and research. They and other scholars like Kinnare Lahad noted that we need to study singlehood both as a rising demographic as well as a perspective, the way gender and women studies has done in the past. Building on this, we note that singlehood should be used as a category of analysis, the way Joan Scott referred to gender as a category of analysis to herald the discipline of gender studies. In this way, single studies seeks to do for the study of singlehood what women's studies and gender studies has done to the study of gender in the world. Much like gender studies, single studies aims to be an interdisciplinary field of inquiry. As this collection exemplifies, singlehood can be studied from the perspective of literary studies, history, sociology, political science, legal studies, psychology, science, medicine, urban studies, gender studies, disability studies, queer studies, among many other disciplines. The possibilities are endless. So technically, all of you here in this room can do single studies if you want to. All the academic disciplines have historically developed in the global north and then traveled to the global south. Our aim with this book is to situate single studies from the very beginning at the cusp of the global south and the global north. This has been at the heart of our collaboration between India and the United States. And the contributions of scholars from around the world have allowed us to do this. Why between India and the United States? Because my colleague Craig Wynne, the co-editor, is from the United States. We envisage single studies as a decolonized discipline to start with, right? One which is emerging in a dialogue between the global south and the global north. In line with this, we also envisage single studies as a global discipline. Single study scholars are scattered around the globe with little or no conversation beyond their smaller groups. Our conference in 2020, which Professor Chakravarti was part of, was envisaged as bringing together scholars of single studies and their various disciplinary understandings so that we could collaboratively take the interdisciplinary field of single studies forward. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over this mic to Professor Chakravarti.
Thank you, Ketki. I'm very thrilled, delighted, very, very happy that this book has come out, and also to be happy here at the launch. To be able to, be a part of this event is a huge privilege. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think I'm just going to sort of start with a slightly provocative question, which is, what drew you to it? Is there a personal issue here? Is there a life experience issue here? Because I was drawn to work with single women largely because of my own experiences. So as a single person who had very, very clear ideas about not getting married from a very young age, and which people found hard to understand. So I had struggled pretty much most of my life trying to make people understand this. And then I thought, maybe I need to sort of have a kind of more academic, disciplinary response to it as well, not just sort of negotiating my own life, but also to understand what it means and why is it so hard, even for very, very privileged people like me or I'm sure you, to actually live with this identity or to embrace this identity, because I've never seen it as a stigma. I've never seen it as, I've never seen myself as a sad spinster. And I think that was my sort of trigger point where I felt that I needed to explain this in a more cogent fashion to the world, in a more sort of perhaps academic way, as I said. My question to you is, what was your trigger? What was your reasons?
I would say it's fairly similar, and I'm glad to be in great company. So not just me, but I think most of the scholars in this book and most scholars who write on singlehood are single folks, right? So either single by choice or single by heart or single by circumstance, and people like you and me who are single by heart. But they happen to be single, and that has not been very different for me. And I have been very open about it. I've been very open about it in my writing because I've written 2 personal essays on being a single woman in India. One is Singlehood Unlimited in Square Peg, and the other is what are my friendships as a single woman? What different kinds of friendships do I have, human as well as non-human, as a single woman? So I've been very open to it, and my scholarship is definitely affected by that. And I think more than the scholarship, my commitment is to single studies to start with. My commitment is to single studies. But I started thinking about singlehood in 2016 when I was finishing my PhD, when I was in Mumbai. And I was pretty much always a single woman. And I thought, what does it mean to be a single woman? What does it mean? Because I had questions about belonging. I had questions about community. I had questions about loneliness. And I was like, what does it do to other people? What are other people's experiences on this? So that is where it started. And then I discovered Bella de Paulo. And then I discovered other writing. And I'm like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted to say. So then I thought that why not think about this, bring my personal, not just experiences, but my personal interest in this topic, right? Because it directly affected me. I thought, why not bring it within my scholarship? And having said that, I'm of course highly, as you, I'm highly critical of marriage, right? And any friend of mine who gets married will be grilled by me, not because, not on why they are single, but why are you getting married? That is my question today. So, and But having said that, I feel a lot of scholars of singlehood are also married and have children. A lot of excellent scholars. So it's not a matter of, it's not a criteria for doing single studies. Definitely, so for instance, as a woman, as I said before, I do masculinity studies. So it's not a criteria for doing single studies, but definitely I feel that being a single woman has helped me look at it from a different perspective. And should I be or not be single, that doesn't matter, that perspective remains.
Thank you for that. I think, this also hinges upon a question that, we are struggling with in every field, which is, what is the role of experience in, whatever academic work we do, especially when we are studying identity movements. We are now increasingly being told that if you don't have that identity, you don't have a right to say anything about it, or produce scholarship on it, or produce knowledge about it. So which I'm perfectly sort of in sync with from a certain point of view, but again, because you touched upon that, would you like to sort of expand a little bit about, what does it mean to do single studies if you're not single, or the other way around?
Yeah, that is very interesting, because I somehow feel it becomes a question of who's speaking for whom, right? It's a question of who's speaking for whom, and for single studies, as long as I think the perspective is from single studies, as long as the person who's doing it, I don't care if that person is married or not. As long as you're not being singlist, as long as you are not promoting singlism, I don't care. I don't get what your personal life is like. As long as you are able to, because there are really excellent scholars who are doing that work. I don't want to dismiss their work. For instance, Eric Klinenberg, Professor Sarah Lamb, so many of them. So I'm like, and their commitment to their work is seen. But at the same time, some of them I can see the difference, the way Professor Bella De Paulo writes about singlehood, right? Because she's single at heart. And the way Eric Klinenberg would write. There is a difference in personal experience. There definitely is. But I would still not dismiss somebody's work just because they are not single. So in this case, I wouldn't say that that if you're not single, you shouldn't write about it. Everybody should write about it, I feel.
No, so the larger question was like, whether this can be seen in terms, it is an identity, but whether it can be seen in terms of developing into a kind of identity movement or not, whether you see possibilities of that. Anyway, we can talk about that later, because I've actually worked with the single women's movement, so my perspective is really comes from a slightly different area. So my other question is, because I'm very, very curious about this, actually. I really do want to know. It's not just that I'm having a conversation with you on stage. But how do you conceive single studies as a discipline? Because, of course, it has to be interdisciplinary and, to make any sense. And as your book shows, that, it's really enriched by the different disciplines from where, you've taken scholars' writings. So I was just wondering, like, when we conceive of single studies as an interdisciplinary sort of coming together of various strands of scholarship, how do you sort of see it panning out, or how do you see it developing? So, yeah.
So I do, I do see it developing, especially with, let's say, newer disciplines like, let's say, legal studies. Like coming into the fray and saying that, okay, let's look at singlehood from the perspective of law. Or and I've been trying to for India, as I said before, I've been trying to get historians to think about singlehood, for that matter. Or trying to think about, let's say, the singles economy. So trying to think about the market and single people. And to come back to that other question, definitely I do think that there should be and there can be a movement around singlehood. It doesn't matter if the identities are so diverse. It is because the identities are diverse is why it's important for there to be a movement. But I feel the interdisciplinarity question is just the way women studies is, right? So when you look at gender studies, when you look at gender as a category of analysis, you can think of it from any perspective. So similarly for singlehood, you can think of it from any perspective, right? And we have said that. You can, political science, you can do that. You can talk about who's voting at the moment. So for instance, in that sense. So you can, so it's not confined to one, and it's an interdisciplinary area of inquiry. So you cannot pin it down to one kind of discipline. Even though me, as somebody who teaches within sociology, does teach single studies, I do always say that, okay, this is a interdisciplinary field of research. By the time you are finishing your course in sociology, you should be able to do this kind of broader work, to be able to kind of think about things more broadly and not be stuck to your discipline of, let's say, sociology or literature or history, but to be able to take ideas and then run with it. So I think that is what single studies is letting you do. It's inquiring about singlehood. I don't care how and what. It's like you take that idea and you run with it.
I'm just asking you these questions as a kind of, bad cop kind of questions, because one has always struggled with gender studies because on the one hand, you want it to be a discipline for it to be taken seriously institutionally. Yes. So we've struggled I have struggled for about, 2 decades of my life doing just that, explaining things to the UGC and, why we need an MA course, what will the MA course carry, why these things are important. Is this a discipline? I still get that question. So on the one hand, you're trying to give it the credentials of a discipline. So you're trying to give it a methodology, a kind of, disciplinary outlines. Yeah. So, and method is very, very important. So, so on the one hand, I think, we are always struggling against this institutionalization of a discipline. And on the other hand, running with it, as you said, and leaving it at the level of, this is a perspective. So you can use it for any research. It's a standpoint. It's not a kind of, a discipline with very strict sort of methods and outlines. So that's, I think that's a question that we really need to debate when we come up with sort of new areas of study. How much sort of what is called academic rigor needs to be infused, and how much, therefore, because the other question that's always asked is, then what is specific about it? So are you thinking of it as something, because again these questions will come up, as something that you can teach at an undergraduate level, or just as maybe a course at the research level, or are you thinking of it as something that the UGC will recognize? Or so how are you sort of conceiving it is my question, because I have qualms about both issues. I mean, making it too much into a discipline, but leaving it too loose, then then it doesn't. And I've had the same problems with queer studies, for instance. So yeah, so one has had these experiences. That's why I just wanted to talk about it a little bit more. Perhaps I'm not sure this is very interesting for the audience, but it is something I really want to discuss.
No, this is very important, because at the moment, and you must have noticed that in the poster, there is this ISSA, ISSA with a little star, yeah, that is there. So that is the International Single Studies Association, which I'm a part of. So, and why are we doing that as an association? Why are we trying to bring it together? One is the question of visibility, to give that visibility and to say that let's bring everyone in the fray. Of course, the moment when we started it, I mean, we're still in the, we don't have a website. We're still at the very beginning stage. We're still deciding who's on the executive committee, who's on the steering committee. But I was, let's say, one of the main people who had a discussion with a friend who came up with the idea. So that's what we're trying to still define the boundaries of, how are we trying, how do we think about ISSA, and do we keep it free floating? Do we keep it, do we host it at a university? And we've decided not to host it at a university. Right? We've decided to keep it free floating. And our initial idea was to have only academics on it, but eventually we want to kind of include, let's say, artists, advocates, and all of that. So kind of to think about single studies in a broader way, not just in the academic sense, but also to include singles advocacy, to include, let's say, artists, to include literary or artistic work on that. So we are thinking about it in that broader kind of framework. So I think maybe that helps. And I do want to kind of at some point set up a center for single studies, and kind of, so my aim is, and that was the aim of ISA, is to give us some visibility. Is to say we are there, we exist. Right? And that's what at least women's studies has done, even though we have struggled. I know, because I've done my PhD in women's studies. I know it is hard. I know there is no funding. And the same thing could happen to single studies. But that doesn't mean that people aren't aware of it now. Right? So I think it's more about the visibility, even though I'm sure at some point we will struggle with funding. Or maybe we won't. Maybe we will find an interdisciplinary way, or maybe we might find somebody in the world who's able to think of something which will help fund it. Or maybe it will become a big enough demographic so that people are like, oh, the market might be interested in his demographic, right? Just the way we have the pink economy, right? So maybe that might help, because it's a really large demographic, right? And, you know, like we have to rethink cities, we have to rethink housing, we have to rethink so many things, because if people are not going to marry, or people are going to live alone, we have to rethink, we have to redesign a lot of things. So I think that is going to affect cities, that is going to affect governments, that is going to affect, let's say, civil society. So we need to, I think that visibility then, and the growing demographic, that might help us maybe get the funds, or get the visibility, or bring people on board, or bring the funding, bring the money. So that way I feel hopeful. I always feel hopeful.
No, this is an interesting point you've raised, because it's something that I have been, like me and my colleague, because we've just done this book on cultures of aging and ageism. So the aging queer person or the aging single person is very much at the focus of this book. And what you're saying about, you know, services will have to be redesigned, cities will have to be rethought, all of these things, because we are really noticing, you know, a lot of things are changing because of the pressure of demographic, because we have an aging population, and in most parts of the world, this is also, you know, affecting, say, voting patterns, elections. You know, will the young vote? Do the young care to vote? No, they don't. The old will vote, and therefore, you know, what policies should you be therefore pitching? You know, do you talk about pension, or do you talk about climate change? So, I mean, those kinds of things actually. In terms of what the governments are trying to do, when you have a demographic which is so huge, and who are probably the voting people, then, it's interesting, because it also reminded me, because I have worked fairly closely with rural women, and the rural single women's movement, which has been going on since the late 90s in this country. And hasn't got a lot of visibility, but they have actually a lot of impact, which is very curious, because you talked about visibility, but, you know, it's not always that visibility equates impact. So they've actually had, you know, impact on policy. They've had impact on things like pension schemes for widows, on housing policy, like you were saying. And so I've worked very closely with them. And one of the things that they've always told me is the impact that they really want is political impact. And for local level elections, like the Panchayat elections, for instance, increasingly the single women's movement are offering candidates. And this I see in my own field, in Darjeeling, where because single women, it's interesting because single women are often seen as women who don't have families to look after, so they will have more time. to give to their constituencies, which is not always the case because they are struggling most of the time. But this is how it's often perceived. And in Himachal, for instance, there have been a lot of these single women leaders who've then gone on to become panchayat leaders. And clearly the community sort of has rallied round, voted for them, and which is kind of interesting when you think about, the kind of stigma that single women have. But at the same time, socially, politically, they're having some kind of impact. And clearly there's some kind of thinking going on, political thinking going on, which makes people think that, or it might even be the other way around, that probably they're thinking, oh, she's a single woman, we'll manipulate her very easily. So let her be panchayat leader, we'll decide, what to do. Because when married women become panchayat leaders, their family members, the male family members, actually sort of, in effect, are in power. So it's the husband or the father-in-law, and it's just the woman becomes a rubber stamp. So in the case of single women, perhaps that is the kind of thinking that she doesn't have male family members who'll interfere. So maybe the community at large can, sort of manipulate her. I don't know what the thinking is. I've thought a lot about it, but this is again an important issue I think that we need to think about is when we are thinking about impact or when we are thinking about visibility. Again, they don't equate one another. The other larger point is also, this, because largely we tend to think of singleness or single identities as having a lot of purchase in a kind of urban context. But, my work has actually sort of shown me that there are so many, because of migration primarily, there's so much rural to urban migration happening, male migration largely, and now a lot of women are also migrating on their own. So there's a lot of women sort of who are kind of left behind. So we've always known this in a certain sense from the 80s onwards. In economics, people have been talking about women-headed households. So how do those households come about? They come about because the men migrate and don't come back. So I think also within the rural economy, certain kinds of shifts are happening because of this increasing demographic. And I think it's something, and this is, I don't know whether this is similar to your own experience. I have really had long conversations with economists, and they're still not interested in it. I said, you have to be interested in it. I mean, the market is interested in the single person consumer, clearly. And you have ads and things, which are really geared towards the single consumer. And the single person's economy, which is very different from the family economy. So, you can actually mark these shifts. But I mean, in serious, I don't know if anybody in the audience has any sort of understanding of this, why economists are still not taking single people seriously. I would really like to know. And so, what has been your experience with economists? Have you had any sort of run-ins?
No experience with economists.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we should really try and do that. So the other question I had is I mean, in order to understand this demographic sociology, you're a sociologist, so my question is to you. I'm a poor literary person. You have to explain this to me. Why indeed, we see this as a phenomenon. This demographic is really going up, shooting up, let's say. It's, amazing rate of the rise in rates of divorces, the fall in rates of marriage, the increase in age of marriage that is happening the world over, of course. People are waiting longer to get married, sometimes choosing not to. Why do you think, this is happening? And, I mean, for me, it's very obvious. I mean, marriage is a mad institution. So, I mean, people are finally seeing the light of day. No, I mean, but jokes aside, I really would like you as a sociologist to explain to us a little bit about why this demographic is going up in this fashion.
Yeah, so a number of scholars have written about the rise in singlehood. And so two scholars specifically, Eric Linenberg and Eliakim Kislev, and they say one is that they maintain that the rise of singlehood and the decline in marriage is related to urbanization. So one is urbanization, and this is something that we've seen a little bit in India, but I have my doubts about it because as some of my research has shown that yes, there are a number of single people within urban India, but as well as rural India. But it's not necessarily that cities are conducive for single people to live in. But anyway, urbanization is something that is seen as helpful in the rise of single people. The feminism and the women's movement has been very, very helpful has been a major factor in falling rates of marriage, as well as in the rise of singlehood, and the risk aversion to divorce, right? So when you know that there are high rates of divorce, there's a greater likelihood that you will either not marry or delay marriage. Then Eric Lindenberg calls the communication revolution as one of the reasons in the rise in singlehood, because there are now we don't need families. We can communicate in different ways, right? With each other. We have, and he was writing this when social media wasn't exploding as much as it is now. But the communications revolution definitely has helped us kind of be more in touch with each other than before, right? So we don't necessarily feel the need to be married. Migration, as you mentioned, is one of the reasons, and also financial stability. So one thing in India, to go back to that one point, in India, higher levels of education for women has been a reason for either late marriage or not marrying at all. So this is something that if you read Sara Lam's book, Being Single in India, you will see that. And that's something that Eliakim Kislev as well writes. So high levels of education. So you'll see more and more women who are single have higher levels of education, have PhDs, or maybe have at least have had access to higher education. The other point is financial stability. So financial stability can come in two ways. One is if within the capitalist economy, if you have financial stability, there is a chance that you might not need to get married, because very often marriage becomes a way for you for economic stability, right? So if you have financial stability within a capitalist state, then you can. And welfare states have large numbers of people who are not married, because the welfare state acts as the family, right? The welfare state is looking after you. So you don't really need to get married, because everything is taken care of. So either you have the rise of either you have the welfare state, or within the capitalist economy you have enough money to look after yourself. Then why would you get married? Because marriage is, apart from is definitely an economic institution apart from being a social institution. So if you have that covered, if the state is looking after you in terms of your employment and unemployment, if it's looking after you in terms of healthcare, why would you get married?
So you did talk about financial stability, you did talk about, but there is also the social aspect, and I think the social aspect remains very powerful. And even as we speak of increasing demographics of singlehood, as you mentioned, there is also a huge glorification of marriage that is going on. Not marriage so much as the wedding. It's like we've been watching endlessly, rich people getting married, the big fat Indian wedding, and even in films, the celebration of that, the Karan Johar films, but of course, that'll happen because the market is interested in it. Lehengas cost 11 lakhs and people wear them, and of course the market is interested. While we are talking about rising demographics of singlehood, we are also seeing a certain kind of celebration of marriage and weddings. So what would you say about that?
I really don't know. I think that's the essential contradiction in our society. There is that paradox. So I really don't have too much to say about that paradox.
Right. My next two questions, I'll club them together, in the interest of time, and ask you, because your book is about. It's interesting. No, I think I'll ask this question first, and this is not a scheduled question, which is about the cover, because I really want everybody to know that it was a painting done by Ketki herself, and the multifaceted Ketki. So, would you like to talk a little bit about the cover and this particular image, why you chose as a representative of the singular self?
So I had made this cover, and I had made this painting long ago, and I had titled it "The Golden Body." And it was in my house, and then we thought that let's use an original image. Let's use an original image for the cover, instead of having one of their usual boring standard formats. And I said that you don't want to get into copyright issues, so why don't you take one of my paintings? So I said, just take one of those, and I circulated some of these paintings amongst all the contributors, and they all selected this one. So it was just because they thought it symbolized the singular self, because it was just one person, and it's not gendered. The person is not gendered. Right, so I think that's one of the reasons they liked it. The publishers liked it, and then we zeroed down on it, and now it's become the cover of Singular Cells, and and the painting is in my house now.
So I was just because you just said that this image is not gendered, but would you think, or would you consider that singleness is a very gendered experience, like every other experience, and also clubbing it together with the future directions of your work? Would you like to say something about that as well?
Yeah. So definitely. So we have this commonsensical idea that single women have it worse than single men. But what I want to say is that singlehood is gendered because there is a qualitative difference when we're talking about single women and single men, right? It's just that there's a different kind of stereotype that single women face, and the different kind of stereotype that men face. It's not, we cannot say that this is worse or that is worse, but that it is qualitatively different. So I'll give you an example. So for instance, I did this research where I was looking at renting practices among single people in Mumbai, and I interviewed the equal number of single men and single women, and living alone. Basically, they were living alone. And both faced problems. Now, the problems that they faced were very different for the landlords and the cooperative housing societies. So for the women, it was a question of over-sexualization, right? Because her sexuality is not contained, she is now a threat to the society. So she might be running a brothel. So we don't want to rent a flat to a single woman. But we don't want to rent a flat to a single man as well, because he might not be decent, and he doesn't have a family. So the idea for a man is he doesn't have a family, because family means wife and children in the heteronormative world, right? Not parents, not siblings, right? But wife and child. So because he does not have a family, he will not be a good example, just like women. He's not decent, and he might spoil that housing society, because he will make noise. Why will he make noise? Because he will party, right? So what I'm trying to say is that there is a difference, qualitative difference in the way single men are seen, and the qualitative difference in the way single women are seen. So in that sense, it's gendered. And this is especially so because also we have a lot of research on single women. Everybody wants to work and write on single women. And I'm like, but what about single men? Right? And as somebody who's worked on masculinities, I want to bring together those two aspects of my research, masculinities and singlehood. And I'm working on a new book on single men where I'm saying that maybe single men are, especially those who are single men by choice, are the answer to the missing puzzle in gender equality, because single men are redoing and reconfiguring masculinity. And if a man is not getting married, that means that it's upsetting the patrilineal line, right? He's not getting married, he's not having children. So what happens to the vansh, so to say? What happens to inheritance? right? Secondly, the very often single men by choice. So I've started kind of doing this work, and I've encountered single men by choice who are living alone, who are both the breadwinners as well as the homemakers, right? So they are questioning gender roles. And thirdly, single men are also questioning the social order, because they are refusing to get married and have children, and that they're questioning that patrilineal, but they are also redoing their masculinities. They're also redoing their masculinity, and they're questioning what it means to be a man. Because what does it mean to be a man? To be a provider for a wife, right? To have children, to pass on your money, to work, right? But if you're not doing that, then what happens to your masculinity, right? So I think, so that is something that I'm interested in right now. I'm working on singlehood, and I feel that is one of the areas of research that I'm interested in, in thinking about in terms of singlehood.
So, I mean, that's very interesting, but I was just thinking in terms of, literary representations or whatever of the wild bachelor, the playboy, and which is also a kind of masculinity that is often associated. But perhaps you're right in that, that is always seen as sowing your wild oats. That's a phase of life. You get over it, and then you do the serious masculine business of getting married and producing children. So yeah, so the people that you're meeting or talking to, these are urban men in the age group of?
Age group of, let's say, 30 plus.
Right. So they've probably sown their wild oats and are now making a serious choice of not getting married. Right. This is just my sort of closing question, and we can sort of open it up to the audience after this. Is that for your single studies course, how long have you been teaching it, or what are students' responses? Because I'm really, really very interested in knowing that.
So I've been teaching it since 2020, January 2020, and I've taught it, I think right now I'm teaching it. Some of my students are here. Wave your hand if you're there. Yes. Some of my students are here. I think they're the 5th batch. And
so you teach it every semester?
I teach it every semester, this semester, Jan to May, to the last, in the last semester of the Masters in Sociology program. And the responses have been varied. So for instance, initially, so there have been batches which have been very receptive to single studies and have, built upon the scholarship that I've given them. So one of the things what I do in class is to say, because we don't have enough material on singlehood from India, I say that let's think about, we are reading about this from the Israeli context, from the American context, from whatever other context. Let's think about this from the Indian context, right? So that is something that I make them do. Secondly, the students, so this is something everyone can check out. The students run a Instagram handle called @SingleStudies. So all of you can check that out. It's a student-run handle. They make posts about, let's say, what coursework we are doing, @SingleStudies, right? So let's say they make posts about the readings. They make posts about the maybe some classroom exercises that we're doing. So that is something they do. And some of the students, it's when I start teaching, it's always a little difficult for them to understand because it's such a new perspective, and many of them are young, right? Many of them are 22, 23. So then that's not something they're necessarily thinking about. So it's something a little, I feel it's sometimes maybe it's a little too early, or maybe it's a perspective they've never encountered. So there are a lot of, they come to the classroom with a number of biases, but some of them do take to it like a duck to water. So there are all kinds of responses. And then once they've started it, they really enjoy it. And then after that, after they finish the course, they still are in touch with me. They send me a post saying that, oh, we saw this here, we saw this post on Singlehood, we saw that post on Singlehood, we saw this video on Singlehood. So they send that to me on Instagram. So that means that I've got them thinking, and that my work is done there, right? I've got them thinking. So my aim is not to turn them into single people. My aim is to kind of get them thinking of looking at the world from that perspective. Right? Looking at the world just the way you look at it, you look at the world through a feminist perspective, look at the world through a singles perspective. But there has been one batch in the middle which I would say has been very hostile, was very hostile, and took it upon themselves to break down whatever I was saying, to deny basically singlehood. So it's not always easy. So that hostility, and that made me think about, and they were throwing singlist comments at me. They were, literally, yeah. So that was a real battle almost, right? So it was embattled. So sometimes the classroom is very positive. Sometimes the classroom is productive. In fact, a lot of, let's say, for instance, the writing that I do or the thinking that happens in the classroom while I'm discussing with the students. So it's a productive classroom, but the classroom can also be embattled and hostile. So there was this particular batch which was very hostile, especially at the beginning, but even otherwise. It's not all of them, but some of them. And that set me thinking, and I thought, like, what would have people who, let's say, taught the first courses on gender, what would have people who have taught the first courses, and what was their hostility? It was that single studies is elite, it's urban, it's a Western phenomenon, and I'm like, this is exactly what echoes the resistance to queer politics in India. It's similarly characterized as non-Indian, urban and elite, and I'm like, that's not true. That's not true. So that is something that I found very hard, and I'm thinking that what must have then been, so for instance, your experience of doing queer studies for the first time, let's say teaching that, or let's say if somebody is for the first time teaching Dalit studies, how are students responding to that? So for me, that was something fascinating, that how did the pioneers handle that? How did the pioneers handle it? That was hard. So that particular batch was hard. So it's been, as I said, the classroom has been productive and embattled at the same time.
Well, thank you very much, Ketki, for sharing all this very honestly and very astutely with us. So now I think, it's open for questions. Anybody would like to ask?
So in an age where, we are thinking about our expressions of selfhood, right, more and more. I remember sitting on Ria's preliminary talk and thinking about how one expresses also a selfhood that is childless. Yeah, I'm interested in like these manifestations of how we show or how we express this idea of a singular self, or a singlehood maybe is more accurate. And it gets me thinking about how then the idea of union, right? How might one be single and yet in union with another human? Or maybe non-human, since you talked about relationships with the natural world with them. So, because it seems to me that if we're defining a singlehood so tightly, and I realize across cultures this is going to shift immensely, and you may share, perhaps, Ketki, some of the insights from the book. The idea of like a singular selfhood in which one is then equated to be sexual, or equated to be singular as in seeking lonely or an existence that does not readily interface with others. Meaning, whereby unions, sexual or otherwise, then do not seem to be, right? They seem to be union, this idea of union, however we may think of it, spiritual, emotional, sexual, whatever. How do we think of singlehood as a selfhood, right, as an expression in terms of union? Sorry for the rather rambling long, I'm still formulating, but it's union that just keeps coming back to me.
So this is very interesting because single people are, there's that idea that they are lonely and alone, whereas it's absolutely the opposite. Single people are far more likely, all the research has shown that single people are far more likely to keep more in touch with their friends, with their family, with their siblings, volunteer in social organizations. So that connection can be with anybody. But that connection is not, that connection is not something that is committed in that way, right? That you are sexually committed or romantically committed and you are in a couple. So this is the thing. Singlehood is a relational category in relation to the couple. Right? And then we can talk about the couple and marriage and how that is different in India and in the West, and there's a long conversation there. But it is in relation to the couple. Right, so the
married couple,
or even the unmarried couple, the romantically and sexually involved couple, right? So single person is, so we have what we call the socially single and the legally single.
Right.
So somebody who is socially single would be somebody who doesn't have a romantic or sexual partner, and somebody who's legally single has a partner but is not married to them. So because they don't get the legal benefits of marriage. Right. So but that union, you can still have a union with your sibling or with a friend, or you can still call and that there's maybe no sexual or romantic feelings there. Or maybe you, so for instance, a lot of people who don't have human children, but who say, I have a cat or a dog, and that cat or dog is my son or daughter. Now that's a union of some kind. Right. So I think what singlehood is trying to do is broaden the horizon of what do we mean by union. Not say it's only romantic and sexual. It can be friendship. It can be, we can we can have other forms of relationships. We can have other forms of relating. And that's something that I explore when I'm thinking about my singlehood standpoint, that single people have that capacity because they are not in what we call the greedy marriage. They are not in that little self-contained unit where it's only about them, their partner and their children, and then hence they are not available for anybody or anything else. Right? So that union, that relation can be with anybody. So then that circle becomes far more broader. You might say that for me, I relate most to a tree. Maybe that union is most important because I feel what the tree feels, and the tree responds to me.
Thank you. Yeah, relatedly, because I have to unfortunately go to an appointment. But I wanted to ask also, do you have any data on those people who have been through marriage and then who become single, but who have dependents, in which that union is fixed, right? There's a responsibility, there's an ethical kind of component then to that, the legacy of that formalized marriage in which children have been born, right? Do you have any data on expressions and manifestations of singlehood in those cases?
In those cases, yes, there would be in the case of divorce and widowhood.
Right.
Definitely, if somebody has studied that, I'm not looked at that because whenever I look at never married people. But they might I'm sure there is enough research and data on people who are, so we call them single by circumstance. Right? That you happen to become single. And just because you're single doesn't mean you don't have children. It could be biological, non-biological, whatever that might be. So for instance, in the community of single people on Facebook, we have a lot of people who have been divorced, who have been widowed, who have been married many times and then realized this is not for me.
Right.
And who have maybe children. So I think it definitely is very much part of the category of the single. Which is also something which is contested, right? But I would say that that comes within the fold of those who are single.
Thank you both of you, and I'm sorry I have to leave, but thank you. Thanks, very interesting.
Thank you. And my question follows Emma. So that was something that I was thinking, but now based on your response, my question is, how is it different from queer studies in a lot of sense? Because it comes down to decolonizing love or the kind of attachment. Let's say I'm going into queer platonic relationships, people defining their own, or say a solo polyamorist. So how, like, what is the difference then between, or is it like a fusion, or, and it's just a thought that came in quickly. It's not fully formed, but I'm just wondering how different are they? Are they different at all in that sense?
There is a lot of overlap, but again, what Ketki was also trying to say was, I think, when I'm sort of identifying as queer, I'm primarily identifying through my sexuality, primarily, not entirely. Whereas singleness is not a sexual identity necessarily. It could be, some people identify singleness as status, as she was saying, legally single, whatever. Some people identify it as an aspect of selfhood, that I, feel that I primarily identify myself as singular. So I think that is the interesting thing that the book is trying to do, is to sort of locate the question not in marital circumstances, but in the selfhood. Short answer would be queerness really is a sexuality-driven identity, whereas singleness necessarily isn't. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, because what I hear, I can identify to some aspect of it. It just never crossed my mind to make an identity out of it. For me, what you're describing could appear as stages, phases that one navigates in and out during one's lifetime. Things that happen in spite of one's wanting, or perhaps even with one's wanting, depending on consequences. So, but the whole idea of making an identity of this, that's why I wanted to come also, because I was curious. It just never crossed my mind. I don't see the advantage. Actually, that's perhaps part of the question. To me, making it a category, actually, I would say it's an anti-category. It feels that it becomes a category when it serves to diminish the norm. Right? So you empower somehow this identity in the discourse of diminishing marriage or union or couple. But can one be in that category without having to diminish the norm? See, I don't know. It just never crossed my mind. The idea that my actual status is an identity in itself. It's just a matter of fact. And sometimes yes, sometimes no. No children, no marriage. Why not just calling it not being married? See, I'm trying to, perhaps I'm not used to this kind of thinking, but I'm trying to picture what is the salient point of making it such an identity, a category, and if there is something else, then being an anti-category.
I completely understand where you're coming from, but the thing is that with singleness, it is a social sort of labeling as well. How you inhabit that social labeling is a different issue. And because any kind of social labeling, particularly of this kind, where it's going against the norm, is also a stigma. So it's a label which can be a stigma, particularly in the Indian context. So you might not want to inhabit that category, but that category comes to you. You are defined by it. And that is where, your response to it becomes important. Because I've never thought of myself as single, but for instance, people have come and said, I'm going to have a sit-down dinner, and I'm just wondering who to sit you next to. And I said, is this a problem? I mean, I can sit next to anybody, doesn't matter. So it's not necessarily a category that I even think about. It is a category which is thrown at me. And once it's thrown at me, I also need to develop tools to negotiate it and decide how I'm going to inhabit this if this is a category. So that's my response.
And we use it as a category. One is when you use it as a category, it becomes easier to study it. And secondly, when you use it as a category, it becomes easier to mobilize around it. So that's one of the reasons. And of course, as she said, it definitely goes against the norms, and it is related to certain forms of stigma and definitely certain forms of discrimination, right? There are, as we said, social legal discriminations, there are, institutional discriminations, there are socio-cultural discriminations. You can also say, as you said, not married, but that's exactly what we say as legally single. Somebody who's not married, but then what are the other benefits are you getting? You're not married, but then are you in a relationship? Are you not? Are those benefits are you getting from having a domestic partner? Which means that if you're sharing a household with somebody else, your costs are cut into half than if you're living alone, right? So everything we have to really analyze. It's not just saying, oh, I'm not married, but then what are you, right? So it's about exploring what are the benefits and the privileges that you have, and what are some of the privileges that you don't have, socially, financially, legally.
I get the point. Yeah. So is it, just to coming back to this, only one aspect of the question I felt perhaps was no answer. Is it part of the discipline to somehow criticize or diminish in a way the norm, or it is not necessarily inherent to this discipline?
It is part of the discipline to not diminish, but to critique the norm, definitely to critique the norm, right? And here we're critiquing not just the social order, we're critiquing heteronormativity, we're critiquing homonormativity. We're critiquing both of that. So definitely we're critiquing marriage per se.
Because again, to go back to your question as well, I mean, coupledom is not only heteronormative. I mean, we have gay couples as well, so yeah.
Thank you for the lovely presentation, both of you. It was a really nice, engaging conversation. I wanted to, just bringing down your own points, I wanted to ask whether media or Bollywood, or like you said that Karan Johar has been glorifying all these romantic relationships and weddings, etc. Do you think media has a role to play in, say, singlehood also? In the sense that if they are to portray more single stories, more sensitized and more nuanced real stories, would the society also be thinking towards that, or how would that perspective change?
So definitely, Dishari, thank you. Finally, so this is something that Craig has been trying to do, Craig Wynn, where he's saying is the script writers to start with are not writing stories of single people. Right? It's about how are you portraying. One is there is a lack of portrayal. There's an entire lack of portrayal, and there's a glorification, and that's done in the media. There's this glorification of romantic love. Let's put it that way, because love can be of different kinds. But what we are questioning is romantic love, right? So there's that glorification. Now, is there within media a portrayal of a single person who's not lonely, who's not sad, who's not depraved, who's not maybe a criminal, who's not a villain like Cruella, who's not crazy, right? So that is not there. We are not seeing that. Or if we are seeing that, are we able to bring that out, and are we able to use that successfully? Just the way we are saying is we don't have queer representation. Right? Similarly, we are saying is, do we have representation of single people who are just like maybe you and me, right? We don't. So that is something that, or maybe that won't sell. That won't sell, because that won't sell. So exactly, that's the thing, that's the question. And also, what do people really want, right? There's that. We are manufacturing that idea that if you don't have romantic love, that your life is not worth living. And that is what single at heart people are saying, is that they're all forms of love. There are different kinds of relating that we have. And that it's not that those who are single don't have love in their lives. They have it in very different ways. You can love a friend, you can love your family, you can love a non-human, you can love your children. You can love your friends.
I mean, you can have sexual partners as well, as long as you don't primarily define yourself through them.
Exactly.
I'll take advantage to ask one question myself. So this is maybe not a question, part observation, part question. I've encountered this myself through fieldwork and casual conversations, and this is so unrelated to the other questions, but do you feel there's a pressure on single people to perform or excel more than others? So to give an example, it's like, oh, if you're going to be single, what else are you going to do? Are you going to win a Nobel Prize? Are you going to become the best PhD scholar in the world? Are you going to become the next Bill Gates? There's this idea that if you're going to be single, it has to be justified. And yeah, it's an observation I've seen through my personal experiences, through fieldwork and all. And I just wanted to ask, have you encountered that yourself? And what are your thoughts on that? And what is this pressure upon single people to be better than everyone else or to justify the single? Or do you have to be single for some reason rather than just being by chance single?
So I think that also relates to the point that you raised about single women in politics. So this is something that, especially in the Indian context, that it is legitimate to be single in two ways. One is if you are a politician, or if you are a nun or a saint or a guru or whatever of that sort, right? Which basically means that you are giving a marital bliss, quote unquote marital bliss, for a greater good, service to the nation or service to God, right? So there has to be a strong enough, big enough reason to be able to give up something so good, so-called so good, to be able to do that. So I think definitely, yes, in that sense, there's a social, not just pressure, but there's a certain social understanding, and that's what I feel makes the Indian context very different, because you can't think of an American president being single, whereas you would want your Indian Prime Minister to be single, because they can devote all their time to the country, right? And what many of them say, right? That then there won't be corruption because I don't have children, I don't have a family, and all of that way. I mean, we can go on and on. But what I'm trying to say is that element of sacrifice and self-sacrifice and doing greater good. So you are absolutely right. There is that kind of pressure that you have to, in that sense, perform. And this is one of the reasons why these two kind of forms of singlehood are so revered, which is not the case elsewhere.
And also to respond to your question, I mean, that is the case with, even when we, who deserves to fly against a norm? You have to deserve it. You can't just do it. So then, there must be a reason for you to do it. So you excel at what you do. And this is what we see in the context of disability as well. So the disabled person has to be exceptional in order to be noticed or taken, or even disability as an issue to be taken notice of. So you have like a Tare Zameen Pe, where this child has to be like a genius in order to somehow excuse his dyslexia. So it's like that, yeah.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Paramita Chakravarti, for being here. Congratulations again, Dr. Ketaki, on your book. And congratulations on the successful book launch. It's a really amazing discussion, and thank you for sharing this moment with us, with the MCH community. And I'd like to just give a vote of thanks to conclude this lovely event. So thank you to our HOI, Dr. Nikhil Govind, for his support. I'd also like to thank the office staff for their support. Thank you to the AV team. Thank you to Chef on Wheels for the snacks and refreshments earlier. Thank you to the Chief Warden and the staff of the International Guest House for providing Professor Chakravarti with a comfortable stay. Thank you, Routledge, the publishers of the book, for providing the event poster and promo materials. And lastly, a warm thank you to the audience for engaging with us and for attending today's event. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.